Hi, I'm Tom with List of Interesting Things. Today in Interesting Political Things is a boring topic at the best of times and a downright dangerous topic at the worst. Gerrymandering. Like and subscribe to stay up to date. Let's dive right in. Gerrymandering is, broadly speaking, the act of drawing an election district unfairly. The act was named after Elbridge Gerry. Confusing pronunciation, I know, but don't worry about it. He was vice president under James Madison and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but he will forever be known as the man who coined the crazy district. He did so by making one Massachusetts so strangely shaped that one congressman remarked that it looked like a salamander. No, remarked another, it looks like a gerrymander. And I assure you that was the height of humor in the early 19th century. Anyway, the United States is what's called a representative democracy. This means that, for the most part, U.S. citizens don't vote directly on what they want to happen. Instead, they vote to elect representatives to do it for them. In our case, these are town council people, state legislatures, and Congress. Whether or not you favor this style of governance is a matter of perspective, but I think it works. It means, at the very least, that I don't need to be well-versed in tariff regulations or immigration law. I can instead elect someone who I think is well-equipped to deal with that kind of challenge for me. So, we elect representatives to vote on issues on our behalf. The president represents the country as a whole. Senators represent their states as a whole, and members of the House of Representatives represent smaller, localized districts. But the question arises, how do we determine the borders of those districts, and how many should there be? Currently, the answers to those questions are pretty easy. How many each state gets is determined by Congress. The most up-to-date law in this aspect is the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, limiting the total number of the House of Representatives to 435. These 435 are distributed roughly evenly among the states based on population, as determined by the most recent census. So, massive California and Texas currently have 53 and 36 respectively, while Alaska and the Dakotas get just one each. Now, once the apportionment of the states has been determined, it's the state legislature's job to draw new districts. In every case, in every state, the state legislatures get to decide how and where to assign these new districts. This is very important, because the state legislatures aren't impartial. They are incentivized to draw districts in such a way that their party benefits most. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say we have a hypothetical state. Let's call this hypothetical state Mind. Get it? Anyway, let's suppose our state has 100 people, for easy visualization. And let's suppose that this hypothetical state gets 5 congressional districts. Let's say that their party affiliations were laid out like this, with 60 Republicans and 40 Democrats. We are the state legislature. We now need to decide how to divide these 100 people into 5 districts, each with roughly 20 people. Proportionally, we might like to have these districts to have 3 Republican and 2 Democratic representatives. A sensible way to do this might be like this. You have 3 Republican districts and 2 Democratic districts. This makes sense. It's reasonably proportional. It's pretty good. There's some problems with it, but we'll face those later. Right now, let's discuss the problems with us. We are the state legislature. We are elected officials. We are politicians. Let's say you were elected by the Republican Party. You would then be incentivized to make the districts that benefit your party the most. How could we do that? Something like this. As you can see, without changing a single voter, I've changed control of the district from a slight majority to unanimous control. This is a huge swing for the party I represent, and an incredible power get. Let's switch it over to the other side. Let's say we're Democrats. We can't gain unanimity, but we can certainly make it more advantageous. Maybe something like this. As you can see, I've drawn 5 districts here. One here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. With only 40% of the population, I've managed to secure 60% of the congressional representation, 2 Republican districts and 3 Democratic districts. And this is a good time to mention that this process isn't just used for Congress, it's used for state houses and local governments too. If this was a city council map, the Democratic Party, in spite of representing 40% of the population, would control effectively 100% of the governing power. I hope this illustrates the power that the person who holds the pen has when drawing these maps. I know this demonstration was a little simple and a little abstract, but let's take a look at some real-world examples. Here we go. Take Maryland. Maryland was gerrymandered to high hell by the Democratic Party after the 2010 census. As such, of their 8 congressional districts, 7 are represented by Democrats. That means in a state that was only 55% Democratic in 2014, the Democrats controlled 87.5% of the representation. On the other side, take Pennsylvania, where Democrats made up 50% of the vote in 2012. Because of the way the districts were drawn by the Republican state legislature, in spite of the huge vote total lead by the Democrats, Republicans took 13 out of 18 congressional districts. That's 72% of the congressional representation, in spite of being a minority of the population. This is not democracy. This is madness. Now, you'll look at some of these districts, a lot of these districts actually, they look a little weird. A lot weird, actually. They twist and loop and curl and move and wrap around each other, carving out exactly what the mapmaker wants carved. That's because real-world maps don't look like this. They're not nice, neat little rows. They look like this. Messy, untidy, sprawling suburbs, dense urban areas, and vast swaths of underpopulated rural areas, with Democrats tending to conglomerate in the city center, Republicans in the outer rural areas, and a purplish mix in the suburbs. How do we draw congressional districts with this? Well, now I'm going to introduce you to a couple new terms. Packing and cracking. Packing is the act of packing all your political opponents into one or a few districts. Cracking is taking little pieces of your opponents and splitting them up. We'll look at both of these from the points of view of Republicans, since they have the majority in this example and therefore would likely have control of the state legislatures. But please bear in mind that this could be, and has been, the reverse situations. If Republicans wanted to crack the Democrats, they might do something like this. They create a district that is majority Republican by carefully choosing where to draw the lines, carving out a little chunk of the Democratic city and making it disappear into a rural majority district. You do that again and again and again until you're left with something like this, having successfully cracked apart the little city center. This is a common gerrymandering method, but it isn't exactly safe. It makes a lot of Republican districts, I should say a lot of districts of one party, but it doesn't necessarily hold them. Any one of these districts is at best 60% Republican. A charismatic Democratic challenger, popular among their constituents, could theoretically push back in any one of these districts. No. Remember, you're the state legislature. You're motivated to create the best situation for your party and for yourself. So let's pack them in. You draw lines in and around the voters of the opposition party, packing as many of them as possible into as few districts as possible. Notice how it cookie cuts around the Republicans and just keeps Democrats, keeping the Republicans out of the packed district. I've even played around with the numbers a little bit. This district has 22 Democrats in it, making the next step even a little easier. Now, with more than half of the Democrats gone, all the districts remaining are more than 75% Republican, making a victory functionally assured. You may notice that this map has gotten a little janky. You might say that that's just my laziness as a map maker, but it's actually very realistic. Working in local politics, I've seen maps with borders that jut in and out of city blocks, in and out and between individual houses. When you zoom in close to the borders, they get truly abominable. This situation is truly the worst. It's undemocratic, it promotes non-competitive races, and it is everywhere. Everywhere. So, I've spent a lot of time talking about malicious gerrymandering, but redistricting is an important part of this representative democracy. It is necessary as populations move and shift and grow and shrink to change how many representatives a state gets and where the lines are drawn. So how do we do it right? Drawing nice even squares like in our first example seems nice, but these are single-party districts. That means that the people who live here and the people running know who's going to win before the race begins. This creates horrible voter apathy. Nobody goes to the polls when they know that they're in a 90% Republican or an 80% Democratic district. It doesn't matter if their chosen party is going to win or lose. They know there's no point to them going. And anyway, nice even lines don't work in real-world maps anyway. They often cut apart important physical and cultural barriers and slice through dense city centers. It just doesn't make sense most of the time. The irritating answer, as is the answer to so many hard problems, is compromise. Compromise between making districts that are sensibly shaped and sensibly sized and competitive and culturally similar and roughly equal in population and, perhaps most importantly, politically non-biased. Allow me to present the notion of the Bipartisan Redistricting Commission, an independent oversight organization employed by the state legislature, but not necessarily influenced by the state legislature, whose job it is to create the fairest districts possible, while keeping all of the aforementioned concerns in mind. In point of fact, 14 states have already passed laws appointing redistricting commissions, although 5 of these are commissions run by the state houses, so take their nonpartisanship with a grain of salt. But in at least 9 states, partisan gerrymandering functionally no longer exists. In all of the other states, though, and I do mean all of the other states, gerrymandering reigns. This is particularly important now as the results of the 2020 census come out and redistricting comes upon us early next year. As a final note on partisanship, I'd like to show you this analysis from 538. Republicans in 2020 had sweeping wins in big Republican state houses. Summing all the districts that Republicans have exclusive control over brings a total of 188 seats. Meanwhile, Democratic strongholds like Washington, Wisconsin, and especially California have removed seats that Democrats could have exclusive control over by passing those nonpartisan commissions. This means that the Democratic total is only 73, with the inclusion of New York, which was decided a few weeks after this article was written. So in spite of the fact that they represent about only 25% of registered voters, the Republican Party will control 2/3 of the partisan redistricting power this year. In the short term, Republicans should find this exciting and Democrats should find this harrowing, because functionally it guarantees another Republican victory in 2022 and more Republican-controlled redistricting commissions in the future. But everyone should find this vile. Gerrymandering is, to echo a common phrase, not voters choosing their representatives, but representatives choosing their voters. There is legislation in motion to restrict partisan gerrymandering, but without much steam, and mostly on the state level. It's mostly on the left, but it's mostly slow and mostly boring. As far as I know, there are no bills in the 2021 Congress to restrict partisan gerrymandering in the 2021 redistricting session. I don't know how this will go in the future, but I know it'll be interesting. One final note. I'm sure you're wondering, if this map that we've been working with was redistricted by a nonpartisan commission, what would it look like? It's an interesting question. Of course there would be cultural questions to be asked, natural barriers to consider, but maybe it would look something like this. The culturally similar inner city has its own district, giving one probably Democratic representative. The culturally similar rural areas make up 2 districts on their own for 2 Republican representatives, and the purple suburbs make up for 2 highly competitive toss-up seats. There are plenty of other ways that you could cut this up. There are plenty of other voting methods that could alleviate this problem, and we might talk about those later. But this solution makes sense, and it works. Thanks for watching. I hope you subscribe to stay up to date on all the most interesting things, and to see all of our election content in the future. There's going to be plenty. And until next time, be like nonpartisan redistricting commissions. Creative and imperfect, but fair. And above all, be interesting. See you next time.